Friends, I have to start off the show with some sad news. Jonathan is no longer with us here at the Gaytheists Manifesto. We want to thank him for the contributions he's made to the episodes up until now, and we still consider him a dear, dear friend. With that, here's the show. Coming to you on Secular Media Network, this is the Gaytheists Manifesto, your source for news, commentary, discussion, and debate at the intersection of the atheist movement and the LGBT rights movement. I'm your host, Callie Wright, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Daniel Wolfsong.
Hey, everyone.
And we have a very special guest, Ryan Bell. Ryan, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Thank you so much for being here. So, you've been kind of making the rounds lately around this Year Without God project, and that's not the main reason that I wanted to have you here, but it is pretty cool. So if you wouldn't mind, go ahead and kind of give us the Cliff Notes version of how that project came about and what it all means.
So Year Without God came about after being a pastor for about 19 years in the Seventh Day Adventist Church and becoming little by little, much more liberal within the context of a very conservative, one might even say fundamentalist denomination. And I had really come to the end of my time with the Adventist Church. I had become so progressive and changed my views so much that I really didn't fit within the denomination anymore. I like to say I was the last one to find out. My denominational leadership was the one who clued me in that I had really outgrown the church. What I didn't realize at the time is that in many ways I had outgrown all of the church, all churches. But at that point I really only realized that I had outgrown the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And I tried to look around for another type of church, which didn't go very well. I was pretty burned out on church in general. And then I decided to just take a break from looking for a church. I figured I needed some time away to regroup and think through some things. And in the midst of that process, around the end of 2013, I realized that I had never given serious consideration to what up until then had only been a nagging suspicion in the back of my mind that perhaps there wasn't a God at all, and that all of these efforts to connect with God through various religious practices, whether it would be Christianity or Judaism or Hinduism or Islam or whatever, were all seeking after something that actually wasn't there, which could explain a lot of things, why prayers seem to go unanswered and why the Bible doesn't seem to reflect my highest ideals all the time and all those kinds of things. And so I just decided that I would take a year and examine my beliefs, really look at what the atheist option looks like, because I had never really seriously even looked at atheism. I didn't know any really prominent, and by prominent I just mean atheists who talk about being atheists. Like, I just didn't know any. So I just decided I would do a year, almost like anthropology, just visit some atheist groups, talk to as many atheists as I could, of, well-known ones and just ordinary people who don't believe in God, and just find out their reasons, what their background was. And what I found out was that a lot of people had a very similar background to my own, similar experiences, and their exploration led them to the conviction that there is no God. And so I just decided to commit a year to this. It was the very end of December, so it was sort of that time of year when you start thinking about what next year is going to be like. So I just, almost on the spur of the moment, said, I think I'm just going to take a year and really give myself space and freedom to think about this. So that's what Year Without God was, 2014.
Very cool. So, in one of the things that really struck me in listening to you on some other shows like Dogma Debate was, you mentioned when you were first sort of starting to doubt what was going on, something that really sort of pushed you in that direction was the church's treatment of the LGBT community. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Oh, yeah. Again, for me as a straight, white, cisgendered, I could go on,
right,
male, I I was slow in coming to understand issues around sexuality and gender, in part because I didn't need to. I was, a straight man born in a straight man's world. So little by little, I discovered that in my church back in Pennsylvania, one of my leaders actually who's had a son who was gay, and he just mysteriously didn't show up to church. And after getting to know him at his house and other places, I understood why, that he had been shunned from his previous church. They were sort of new in our area. And he was the first person that I really sat down with, and he was so patient with what I can now only imagine was stupid questions. As I asked him what it was like to be gay and why were these stereotypes about the gay community, were any of them true, and what was his experience, and just all those types of questions that if you genuinely didn't know anything, you would sort of want to ask. And he really helped me understand what it was like for him from his experience. Then when I moved to Hollywood, of course there's a larger gay community in Hollywood, and before the first 1 or 2 years of my time at Hollywood was up, I had actually baptized a young woman who was in a relationship with another woman, and they were coming to church together, and they were the first couple, that I committed couple that I knew, and became great friends. And it almost, my conversion, if I can put it that way, to sort of LGBT equality in all areas just sort of gradually crept up on me. I never remember struggling with it very much. And I just thought, well, these are people and they seem like beautiful people, and there are straight people who are nice and straight people who are terrible, and I'm sure there are, gay and trans and, all kinds of people that have all kinds of characteristics. So why should they be any different just because of their sexual identity and preferences and so forth? So I sort of just evolved on that issue, and then Proposition 8 came along in California, which in 2008 was the voters, enough of them signed the petition to put it on the ballot, which was to change the California Constitution to make marriage only between one man and one woman. And I thought, well, I'd seen other efforts like that around the country, and I was surprised. California is the left coast. I was like, how could this be happening in California? Certainly this won't succeed. And then my own denomination, which has a history of really strong religious liberty advocacy, jumped on the side of Prop 8. And I couldn't believe it. I mean, I knew the Adventist Church was against gay relationships, same-sex relationships of whatever kind, but I didn't think they would jump into the legal battle, because we haven't jumped into the legal. The Adventist Church didn't jump into legal battles around abortion, even though we have a position, the church has a position that it's against abortion. It doesn't get involved in the pro-life stuff. But in this case, they decided that it was important to get involved. And so a few of my friends and I thought this was too much, and we started a website called Adventists Against Prop 8. And we really weren't even taking a very bold stand at that point. We were simply saying, just on religious liberty grounds alone, no matter what you think about homosexuality and religion, just on the basis of religious liberty, you should be opposed to Prop 8, because we were trying to cast a big net, for Adventists. And I got called into the denominational office and really was in big trouble for taking a position on such a controversial issue at the time, against what the church had said. And I pretty much said I was actually holding up the church's historic position of religious liberty, and it was those other guys that weren't, which that didn't go over very well. So I thought I would lose my job actually back in 2008, but they let me continue as a pastor. And of course Prop 8 passed, and then the struggle to overturn it and all of that. So that really put me in community with a lot of other, the Metropolitan Community Church here in LA, and some rabbis that are a couple of lesbian rabbis that have been really central to the marriage equality struggle. I went to my first gay pride parade about 3 or 4 years ago here in LA, and
nice.
Yeah,
so just got really involved as an ally the best I could.
So, I mean, how common do you think that is? Because I know there are a lot of, religious people, deeply spiritual religious people who are very, very strong allies. And, I never want to shun an ally, especially when it comes to trans issues, because we're still sort of at the beginning of that whole movement. But, and I don't want to turn around and say like, it's right here in the book that says that, like, I deserve to die. Like, how do you reconcile that? So, being a person who came from that background, I mean, I was never super, super religious. So that's not necessarily a world that I understand super well. So like, how does that work, do you think?
Yeah, I haven't studied much in terms of theology as it relates to trans issues. I just don't think that's within the scope of what the Bible talks about at all. Like, I just don't. It'd be like saying, what does the Bible have to say about HBO? It's just like,
right.
Interesting.
Like, there was no HBO. Paul doesn't have anything to say about HBO. You're going to have to use your moral imagination to figure out, like, what to do there. And
right.
what about speeding on the freeway? No, the Bible's not going to give you any direct advice about speeding on the freeway. You're going to have to actually use your brain. So that's not to say there weren't trans people in biblical times, but it just doesn't. There's just no sense in which biblical writers even acknowledge that I'm aware of, except for maybe like the eunuch. Like, you have these sort of gender and sexuality queer people, and I think the Ethiopian eunuch is one of the great examples of a non-conforming person, probably against his will. He was probably enslaved or something, and was castrated and turned into a eunuch. And then, there's this remarkable story about Philip's encounter with the Ethiopian eunuch, and he accepts the gospel and is saved, according to the story. And when I grew up, we just never talked about what it meant to be a eunuch. That was just almost like his job title. It didn't have anything to do with his sexuality or how that would have like maimed him in some way or othered him, by not being sexually normal, as it were. So that's one area. And then I think, in as much as trans issues aren't reflected in the Bible, one liberal argument about the Bible is that really gay issues aren't reflected much in the Bible either. And when Paul, and especially in the Old Testament, but then Paul unfortunately repeats that Old Testament. I mean, what's really in view there, some say, is that, is like temple prostitution or cultic sexuality rituals that were not, Jewish or Christian. And it had less to do, really what people will say is that loving mutual same-sex relationships are really not within the purview of what's described in the Bible.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I've heard that argument too, that it's more about hedonism and promiscuity and stuff like that, more so than it is about actual same-sex attraction or same-sex relationships. And
or it could even be like, I've heard people make the argument that it's a social justice issue as well. Like some same-sex relationships were slave to master, or master to slave. So in Roman times, that was fairly common to have like a young boy. A soldier may have like a servant, who also performs sexual favors. And so in a way, like, some have tried to say, like, Paul's against this because it's dehumanizing in that sense, in that context. I think it's a little bit of a stretch to say that that's what he meant all the time across the board. Otherwise, he could have been more specific about that. But
even if the Bible does have things to say about gay people, it's sort of a questionable place to get your morals from. Otherwise, and a lot of atheists like to talk about maybe the discrepancies in the Bible regarding what it really means when it's talking about homosexuality, and just as a moral source in general, it's kind of a bad place to get to get your morals, with laws like stoning women for sexual infidelity, things like that, that any civilized person, even Christians, would find completely ridiculous to follow today. So,
yeah, you'd have to argue that there's a kind of moral trajectory to the Bible that even within the Bible, there's a developing moral ethic that evolves over time. But yeah,
right, from a God that's unchanging.
Right,
exactly.
There's a book about that, isn't there? Is God a moral monster? I think is the name of the book.
That sounds familiar.
I've heard.
I love how Matt Dillahunty says, like, it seems like, God's not a very good communicator, or just didn't choose the right things to talk about because, in the Old Testament, he's very particular about which fabrics or which fibers can be used to make clothing, but a little ambiguous about slavery, or like, if we could have such clear instruction about not cooking a goat in its mother's milk, couldn't we have had a little bit more moral clarity about slavery and violence? But
agreed.
Well, guys, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to be discussing some of Ryan Bell's other work. We will be right back after this with more of the Gaytheist Manifesto.
Today in school, I learned a lot. In chemistry, I learned that no one likes me. In English, I learned that I'm disgusting. And in physics, I learned that I'm a loser.
Today in school, I learned that I'm ugly and useless. And in gym, I learned that I'm pathetic and a joke. In history, I learned that I'm trash.
Today in school, I learned that I have no friends. In English, I learned that I make people sick. And at lunch, I learned that I sit on my own because I smell. In chemistry, I learned that no one likes me.
In biology, I learned that I'm fat and stupid. And in math, I learned that I'm trash.
The only thing I didn't learn in school today?
The only thing I didn't learn today.
The only thing I didn't learn
is why no one ever helps.
Kids witness bullying every day. They want to help, but they don't know how. Teach them how to stop bullying and be more than a bystander at stopbullying.gov.
Before we jump back into the show, it's time to thank our patrons. We have a brand spanking new page over at patreon.com/The Gaytheist Manifesto, where if you're so inclined, you can make a financial contribution to the show to support what we do. This week is our very first round of shout-outs for our new patrons, so thank you all so much. This week, we are recognizing the prophet Jeremiah from the No Religion Required podcast, my dear friend Melissa, Jim Dobler, my good friend Hugh Mann, Trav Mamone from the By Any Means podcast, and my good friend Sandy Pants. Thank you all so much for believing in us enough to contribute to us financially and for being a part of this movement. Patrons of the Gaytheist Manifesto have access to all sorts of cool stuff, like a big shout out on the show, premium content, including an audio journal I've decided to keep documenting the more personal stuff I don't dive into on the show, and an exclusive patrons only hangout once a month. If you're so inclined, head over to patreon.com/The Gaytheist Manifesto to become a part of this movement and support the show. So the other thing that you're involved in, Ryan, that I really wanted to talk about, especially because there's so much intersectionality with the LGBT community, is PATH, which stands for, if memory serves, People Assisting the Homeless. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
So what exactly does PATH do?
Well, PATH is become quite a large homeless service agency that's all over California now, not just in Los Angeles. And we do really everything from the first encounter with a homeless person on the street through our outreach teams, through all the case management process that you might imagine. And then we have an arm of PATH that actually builds affordable housing and permanent supportive housing, which is permanent supportive housing is actually typically housing for the formerly homeless or people that have ongoing service needs. So there are case management services within the development and within the apartment building. So everyone that lives there has access to social services on site. So we actually build apartment units like that as well. And then, the bulk of the work we do is connecting individuals to the services that they can access, whether it's housing vouchers, veteran services, public social services, health benefits, whatever, family services for their kids or whatever. So, this is a complicated bureaucratic process, as we often find out if you need to ever get your driver's license renewed at the DMV or something like that. It only gets worse, from there, or at least not worse, but maybe just more complicated. So, case managers work day in and day out with individuals that have been homeless, maybe are living in one of our shelters, and we call them navigators. They're literally helping people navigate their way to housing.
That's so cool. So what was there a particular reason that homelessness is something that you're passionate about, or is it just something that's always been close to your heart, or is there a story behind that?
I mean, there are probably stories. I mean, pastors encounter homelessness. I mean, there's really almost, no matter what city you're from, churches are very often a sort of a avenue that homeless people pursue in order to get help. And so, especially when I moved to Hollywood, but even before that in Pennsylvania, I worked with a new sort of startup local agency that was helping homeless families figure out a pathway to housing. And then when I moved to Hollywood, we literally had people sleeping on our property, around our property, 7 days a week. And as a Christian, as a pastor, and who was trying to teach his congregation to look after the community in loving ways, the immediate obvious thing right outside our door was, and even inside our door. I mean, during our services, we had 3 to 5 homeless individuals that would join us on a regular basis for church, and so it was right there among us, with us, in front of us. So we were confronted by it, and it was maybe the most obvious social need that we could see.
So what exactly is the situation as far as LGBT homelessness? Because I know trans people face a disproportionate level of homelessness because of problems with poverty and unemployment and underemployment and that sort of thing. And I know in Cincinnati, where I live, there are actually no shelters that are welcoming for trans women. If a trans woman wants to go to a homeless shelter, she has to go to a men's shelter, which is a pretty sad situation. I have to hope in an area like the one that you're in that the situation is at least a little better than that.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we have a very large organization here in Los Angeles called the Los Angeles LGBT Center. There are actually 2 or 3 different locations. It's one of the larger LGBT centers in the country, and they help individuals navigate social services. And a lot of what we see in Los Angeles is our young people, LGBT youth, who sometimes we call them runaways, but I like to remind people that at least a significant percentage of them are throwaways, people that, young people that have been kicked out of their families, and just rejected, by their families. And so they're, at a quite young age on the street fending for themselves. And often they'll move to Hollywood or Los Angeles, because it's warmer. If you're going to be homeless, it's easier to be homeless in LA than it is in Cincinnati. And also there's a dream or an illusion of opportunity in Los Angeles, whether it would be in the music industry or the acting industry, movie industry. So we see a lot of transplants to this area of young people that have been excluded from their families and communities because of their gender or their sexuality.
God, that's heartbreaking.
It really is. It's tough. And we have, we've got a guy that hangs around Path. I don't think he's accepting of services at the moment, but he's sort of always around, and he appears to be, some days he appears to be male, other days he appears to be more female, and he wears a variety of different kinds of clothes and styles his hair in different ways, and And he's very friendly. He talks to himself a lot because he has other severe issues going on as well. But I talk to him when I walk to the 7-Eleven to get a drink, and he's out there, and he'll walk with me sometimes and just chat. And I've gotten to know his name, and he starts telling stories. You never know, like, what's actually going on. But he just reminds me that there are just people that have been out here a long time, on the street, and it takes a toll.
Yeah, I've actually done that a lot because I used to play in bands when I was younger, and we would always practice in the the not so nice parts of downtown Cincinnati, and there was a homeless guy who would watch our cars for us, and we'd give him some food or throw some cash his way or whatever to watch our cars for us, and we would, after band practice, we would just sit outside the practice space for hours and just listen to this guy tell stories about being in the military and trying to overcome addiction and losing his wife and all that kind of stuff. And I think it's so easy to mischaracterize these people as lazy or worthless or anything like that, and it's so heartbreaking for me to see that happen because, just like anybody else, like they're just people with stories that, are generally are less fortunate. And it's not always because of bad decisions that they've made or, that they're lazy or anything like that. And how do you fight that stereotype?
One of the best ways to fight that stereotype is with stories, people's stories. And I like to remind, this goes back to privilege, which we end up talking about on Facebook a lot,
right.
In the different conversations that you and I get into. Yep. Part of privilege, regardless of where that privilege originates, is that privileged people can afford to make a mistake or two. And so if I make a bad financial decision or if I miss a rent payment, I can probably catch up or I can borrow some money from my dad or my landlord will be forgiving because, I'm an upstanding, employed, white guy in my middle age, middle year. He looks at me and he goes, that guy looks pretty good. So he'll let me be a little late and maybe he'll fine me like $30 and then he lets me carry on renting the apartment. If I'm a trans woman of color with 2 kids tagging along and they make a lot of noise and I didn't, but he might be, oh, this is an excuse to get rid of that person, because we don't really want them around here anyway. So, I think when people talk about, well, people make bad choices, bottom line is we all make bad choices. It's not like some people made bad choices and some people made good choices. No, we all make good choices. We all make bad choices. It's some people have the capacity to endure those bad choices and survive them better than other people. And if you have a savings account, you can afford to make a bad choice or two. If you have a network of friends that support you, you could probably afford to make a few bad choices. But people who don't have that, they make one bad choice, and it leads to a real crisis, which could cause a person to make another bad choice. And before you know it, they've made one too many bad choices, and they're on the street. Or something happens, like you said, that's not a bad choice, that's totally outside their control. I heard a story once of a woman who was owned her own construction company, and she was injured, as is, I suppose, pretty common with construction workers. And she was building homes and making a good living, but the injury turned into a complication in the hospital that was not her fault, and she ended up being laid up for quite a while, almost like died, as I recall, or lost a limb due to some complication. Anyway, it was serious. Like, she couldn't use her hands, she couldn't work, so she ended up losing her company, and then she lost her home, and then she was homeless, And I'm like, my goodness, this is the person that you would have thought, oh, that she owns her own construction company. She's got it made in a way. And within a matter of a couple years, she was with nothing. Wow. And, managed to rebuild her life due to the help of some social service agencies. And, if you ever have felt, anybody listening to this, you've ever felt bad about yourself for any reason, something happens or someone says something for any reason and you think, I suck. Imagine losing everything and being on the street. It doesn't get much worse than that. That really takes a toll on a person's self-esteem. And then it's just, well, may as well drink or shoot up this chemical so that I at least feel better, you know?
Yeah.
And
I feel like, that's not an experience that I've ever had, but I feel like that's something that I can empathize with. I like to think of myself as generally pretty self-sufficient, and I kind of take pride in that. And, I'm not above asking for help, but normally asking for help for me is like emotional support and stuff like that. It's not like, oh my gosh, like I'm not going to be able to eat this week. Can I borrow $50? That kind of thing. Like, I can totally see how that could spiral downward very quickly. And I guess that kind of feeds into the next question that I was going to ask, and maybe it's already been answered in the previous talk, but if you could sort of debunk some common myths about homeless people. Like, I think anybody who's remotely interested in social justice knows better than like, well, homeless people are lazy, or homeless people are all drug addicted, or, they're all there for something that's their fault. But, are there sort of problematic things that you hear from even like generally progressive people that are sort of, wrongheaded and problematic that, you could just sort of debunk?
Yeah. I think more than you might imagine, progressive people can have the idea that homeless individuals could work but don't. And this is partly because there are some homeless individuals that could work but don't. And the most difficult cases, sometimes involve that. But I think by and large, people are looking for work. I used to work in the job center at PATH, where one of the job centers at one of our locations, where I basically day in and day out helped people refine their resumes, cover letters, and apply for jobs and be as successful as they could in interviews. And several of them found jobs. I think people underestimate the extent to which our homeless are veterans who, whether you agree with war or any particular war, whether you agree with that or not, I don't think it's pretty heartless to at least say those men and women who went overseas to fight those wars, whether they were legitimate or not, were serving a cause that they believed in, and that they were asked by their country to serve, and then to bring them home and not even look after them at all in some cases is just, I think I underestimated the degree to which PTSD is a real thing. I knew it was a real thing, but I didn't really understand how traumatic that is for people and how debilitating it can be. And that, I guess that would lead me to one other thing I would say, and that is that the extent of mental illness among the chronically homeless is sometimes, estimated to be around 50%. And our country, and maybe most countries, I don't know, but at least our country in the United States has not yet decided that it wants to invest serious time and energy and resources into caring for and treating mentally ill people. So the bottom line is that some people are going to need help to function normal, in society in a useful, or useful is the wrong word, but like in a healthy way without some support for the rest of their lives. Not everyone is going to be self-sufficient. Not everyone is going to be able to maintain housing on their own without someone assisting them. In the same way that children and senior citizens, very elderly people, often can't. That we're not, this idea that we're supposed to live on our own and be completely self-sufficient is a myth. And when we expect that of people who just physically cannot do it, I think homelessness is what you end up with.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's enough to almost make you like, I just want to be a socialist. You know what I mean? Like, yeah. It's
yeah. And I think the other thing is the economy. Like, I think in Hollywood and in Los Angeles, it's just it's difficult to pay your rent. It's not like people are lazy or they're not working. They're working, and maybe there are two incomes in the family, and they still can't afford health insurance because maybe they've got 2 hourly jobs that don't provide insurance or whatever. Now with Obamacare, maybe it's a little easier for folks, but still hard because you have to pay. And your kids are in school, they have needs, they have, clothes that they need, and you want them to maybe go to soccer practice, and that might cost something, and you're trying to pay your rent. It's not like people are like going to the Broadway shows every weekend. They're struggling just to pay the rent, and the cost of living is just so high. And as the economy has recovered, the lower income brackets have not recovered, and so there's just a wider and wider gap. And this is another reason, I think, just poverty is the reason why people become homeless.
Yeah, and even in places where rent is more reasonable, I think a lot of people don't realize how expensive it is to be a poor person.
It's very expensive to be poor. Yep.
And it seems almost counterintuitive. But I've experienced that firsthand, and I've read about this too. And our society is just not set up for people who don't have a lot of money, and simple things that we take for granted costs money for people who don't really have that money to begin with.
Yeah, I realized that for the first time years ago when I went to buy a car, and I realized that it was harder for me to buy a $5,000 used car than it was for me to buy a $20,000 new car.
Yeah.
Because the used car required cash, and I didn't have cash. Or in order for the bank to give me a loan for the used car, it needed to be pretty new, and otherwise they wouldn't give me a loan. So I could go to a dealership and get a loan with a really high interest rate for a brand new car, but I couldn't figure out how to buy the $5,000 car, which would have served me just fine. And it's just an example of how people with credit and people with cash have a much, much, much easier time.
Yeah, and even speaking of, the whole concept of credit, it's not like that's something that our culture puts a lot of value on teaching kids and adults how to manage, economics and how credit works and things like that. It's just sort of something you kind of have to figure out, on your own. A lot of people just mess it up.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, we're going to take another quick break, guys. We will be back with Be a Better Ally on the Gaytheist Manifesto.
I'm Dustin.
And I'm Wesley.
We host the Atheist Nomads podcast.
We're godless geeks who take a skeptical look at
politics, religion, science, technology, and history.
We also interview leaders in the atheist, skeptic, and humanist community.
Check us out at atheistnomads.com.
That's atheistnomads.com.
Hello, I'm Alan Cumming. Live Out Loud is calling on the LGBT community to help improve life for gay teens. Take what you know and gay it forward through the Homecoming Project, a chance to return to your old high school and share your story with LGBTQ youth. Your life experiences and wisdom can prove invaluable to teens who may be struggling with their own identities and paths in life. One day can make a lasting difference. Gay it forward with the Homecoming Project. Find us at liveoutloud.info to learn how you can get involved today.
We do a segment at the end of every show called Be a Better Ally, where we pick a subject and we say, like, how can we be better for this certain oppressed, marginalized, misunderstood group. So if you could talk a little bit about how can middle class folks like me be a better ally to the homeless?
Oh man, that is such a good question, and not, like, as with many ally issues, I think not necessarily an easy question to answer. I think there is a general inequality in resources, and anytime municipalities, whether it be small towns or big cities, decide that they want to look into things like affordable housing or inclusionary zoning ordinances that would require developers to set aside units of their new buildings for low and very low income individuals and families. I think those are opportunities that allies could engage in the political process, to say yes to those types of measures, or to say no to perhaps the big developer who wants to come in and build luxury apartments, and there's nothing there for anyone that doesn't make $100,000 a year. For members of the community to say, hold on a second, my kid's elementary school teacher doesn't make anywhere near that much money. She's not a poor person. She's just middle class, and she can't even afford. What about this guy who washes my car every week? How is he supposed to live here? Just engaging in the sort of the democratic discourse about what kind of a community do we want to have? Do we want to have a community where only upper income earners can live in this neighborhood? And probably some people's answer to that will be yes. But, for people that care about the poor and the working poor and the homeless to say, no, actually, we think that's not fair. There should be ways of mitigating those types of negative consequences of wealth inequality. So that's one thing, like the political process and being, it requires people to really advocate and vote sort of against their self-interest. A lot of community organizing is built around self-interest and voting your self-interest, but I think middle class and upper middle class people have to set aside some of their self-interest at times to consider the collective interest, of the community. And it is, in a way, it is a kind of self-interest. It's not in my self-interest for there to be homeless people sleeping on the sidewalks of my town, if for no other reason than I don't like it. It makes me feel bad. And I don't think it should be like that. I'm really at no risk of being homeless. So purely on self-interest, I shouldn't really care about that initiative, but I do care because it's my community. So that's something. I think also there are probably homeless service agencies in the neighborhoods where everyone lives, and to just learn more about it, to be better educated about what's going on with homelessness, to just befriend someone who's on the street, find out their story, so that you're better aware of what people's experiences are. And then there's volunteer opportunities that people can get involved in. We have a variety at PATH. Our Sunday Assembly, for example, here in LA just did a hygiene kit drive. They made 300 hygiene kits that our outreach team uses when we go out on the street to help people who need hygiene products, but also they're a tool of engagement, where we can offer someone a hygiene kit and hopefully break the ice, where we can engage in a conversation with that person about what their deeper needs might be. So there are ways that volunteers can engage in almost every homeless agency that's out there. And I think just, befriending people, building relationships so that you can be a better educated ally. I think those are really good things. And I think if you're tempted to give money to people, and that sort of, everybody has to make their own judgment about that. But if giving money to the local homeless guy that's on your corner feels wrong to you, make a donation to your homeless agency instead. And write them a note and say, instead of giving $1 a day to the guy on my corner, I'm sending you $30 a month to support your efforts, and how else can I get involved? That would make our hearts sing at PATH if people did that.
That's awesome. Yeah, well, and speaking of hygiene kits, one of the things that really blew my mind about homelessness, because when I talk to people about trans issues, so many people, because it's not their experience, say, oh my God, I never even thought of that before. I read a story where apparently it's a not so uncommon thing for homeless women to get themselves arrested so they can have access to pads and tampons. And that was just mind-blowing for me to find out, because, spending a night in jail is better than going without.
Yeah.
Well, especially if you're in a cold climate.
Right.
Like where you live, up north, a night in jail is actually a pretty great deal. But yeah, we do that. Our outreach teams carry not just what you would think of typical hygiene kits, like toothbrushes and deodorant and whatever, shampoo, if they can find a place to use it. But like you said, feminine hygiene products, as well as clean socks and underwear, t-shirts, because people have to wear the same clothes day in and day out. They don't have a dresser to put extra clothes in.
Awesome. Well, Ryan, I know you're super busy and you've been super gracious with your time and dealing with our stupid technical issues. I sincerely appreciate that. I want to thank you for taking the time. Thank you for everything that you do. This has been an awesome conversation, and look forward to doing it again sometime.
Yeah, let's definitely do it again. Thanks so much for having me. It was really great talking to you both.
Thanks. Have a good night.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan.
Okay, bye-bye.
Daniel, you still with me? Okay, cool. We'll go ahead and do the outro of the show because I went and hung up with Ryan. And that, my friends, is going to do it for another episode of the Gaytheist Manifesto on Secular Media Network. I want to thank once again our guest Ryan Bell for being so gracious with his time and taking some time to talk to us tonight. And I want to thank my co-host Daniel Wolfsong.
My pleasure.
You can find the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Gaytheist Manifesto. You can email us at thegaytheistmanifesto@gmail.com. And I am on Twitter at Gaytheist Callie.
And I'm on Twitter at Daniel Wolfsong.
And before we go, I want you to know that if you're lost, if you're hurting, if you're scared, if you feel like no one cares and no one understands, you need to know there is a community out here that cares about you, loves you, knows that you're capable of amazing things and that you are worthy of love. If you're struggling, please don't be afraid to reach out. This is the Gaytheist Manifesto.